Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving headfirst into the wild world of microservices.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild one.
Specifically, we're talking transactions with microservices, and more specifically, how to wrangle your data and keep it from becoming, well, a chaotic mess.
Like trying to herd cats, each with their own agenda, right? So we're trying to figure out how to keep them all in line.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of keeping things in line, today we're talking about the Saga pattern with the expert himself, Chris Richardson of Microservices.io.
He wrote the book on this stuff, literally.
So let's set the stage. Imagine you've got your online store perfectly divided into all these microservices. Orders, payments, inventory, you name it.
Each with their own little kingdom of data.
Right, like little isolated kingdoms.
Yeah.
So what happens when a customer clicks Buy Now? You need to make changes across all of those kingdoms.
And they're not exactly used to talking to each other.
Exactly. So that's where Sagas come in.
It's kind of like, imagine trying to lead an orchestra, but instead of one conductor, you have like 10.
And they're all trying to lead the same song at the same time.
It would be chaos.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So in a perfect world, all these microservices would play together perfectly. But in reality, why can't we just rely on how transactions normally work within a single database? You know, those ACD transactions we've all heard about.
AC transactions, they're great, but only when you're dealing with a single database. They're like a super strict librarian who makes sure every book is returned to the exact right shelf.
Okay, I'm following you.
Atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability, they make sure everything happens perfectly or not at all.
So it either all works out or nothing happens at all.
Exactly. But in the microservices world, it's like having a different librarian for every single book genre, each with their own system.
And good luck getting those librarians to agree on anything.
Exactly. It's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so with ACD transactions off the table, how do Sagas come in and save the day?
So instead of one big complicated transaction spanning across all these different services, Sagas break it down into a series of smaller local transactions.
Okay, so each one affects only one service at a time.
You got it.
So it's less about a grand symphony orchestra and more about like a well-choreographed dance.
That's a great way to put it. Each service knows its steps and knows when to hit its mark.
So let's stick with our online store example. A customer hits Buy Now. Instead of one giant leap, the Saga pattern breaks that down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Exactly.
So walk me through those steps. What's the choreography of a successful Saga transaction?
Okay, so the customer clicks Buy Now, and the order service jumps into action right away.
It's go time.
Yeah, it creates like a pending order in its database.
So it's like reserving a seat, not quite committing to it yet, but putting it on hold.
Exactly. So next it sends out an event.
Okay, like a little message in a bottle.
More like a little digital signal flare, basically announcing to the other services, hey, got a new order over here.
And who's listening for these signals? Is it like an all-points bulletin to the entire system?
Just the services that need to know, you know? In this case, the payment service and the inventory service, they're all ears.
Okay, so the payment service hears this signal, and then what?
It jumps into action too. Checks the customer's credit card, makes sure everything's good to go, processes the payment, and this is important, fires off its own little signal.
Like mission accomplished.
Exactly. Or, sometimes it's mission failed, but let's think positive.
Right. Fingers crossed for mission accomplished. So is our inventory service on the edge of its seat waiting to hear the good news?
Oh, yeah, definitely. As soon as it gets that green light, it can reserve the item, make sure they don't sell out before the order's complete.
Yeah.
Then it gets to send out its own victory message. Inventory updated.
It's like a relay race where everything's perfectly timed.
Yeah.
And our order service is the one waiting at the finish line.
Exactly. If everything checks out, like if the payment goes through, the inventory's all good, then the order service can finally change that order status from pending to confirmed.
Nice. So they've completed the transaction. That's really cool how it all flows together. But what happens if one of the runners trips, What if the payment falls through? Does the whole system just come crashing down?
That's the great thing about the Saga pattern. It's built to be resilient.
Oh, okay, so no need to panic.
Yeah, if one step fails, the whole thing doesn't fall apart. Instead of this catastrophic domino effect, we can basically just hit rewind.
Okay, I like the sound of that. But how do you undo steps that have already been taken? We can't just leave an order hanging in limbo.
So that's where compensating transactions come in. Think of them as the undo button for each step in the saga.
So if the payment fails, we need to basically unreserve the product, right?
Exactly. The payment service would send out a signal,
Like a heads up.
Yeah, like a payment failed message.
Uh-huh.
So the order service hears that and then changes the order status back from pending to canceled.
And what about the inventory service? Didn't they already reserve that item?
Oh, it's listening for those payment failed messages too. It's keeping an ear out. If it hears that, it knows to release the reservation, making sure the item's still available.
Wow, so it's all this back and forth communication happening behind the scenes. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and the best part is we actually have different options for how we want to manage this whole choreography. What we've been talking about is choreography-based Saga, right?
Okay.
Each service is responsible for knowing its own cues and what to do, how to respond. But there's another approach called orchestration.
Orchestration.
Yeah.
So instead of relying on the dancers to know the routine, we have like a conductor leading the performance.
You got it. With orchestration, you have this central conductor called the orchestrator. Very creative, I know.
Right.
But it basically calls the shots, tells each service what to do, when to do it, how to respond, all of that.
So both of those approaches sound really interesting. For someone trying to figure out which one to go with, what are the big differences to consider?
It really depends on your system, how complex it is and what you're trying to accomplish. Choreography is kind of like if you're planning a road trip with some friends.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
It's simple, it's flexible, works great if you've got a small group and everyone's on the same page. But you throw in a dozen more friends, a tight schedule, maybe some disagreements about directions, it's going to get messy pretty quick.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. That's where the orchestrator comes in. They're like the experienced travel agent who makes sure everyone's where they need to be, knows what they're doing, keeps things running smoothly.
Right, so choreography is good for when things are pretty straightforward. But when you need more control over a complex process, that's when you bring in the orchestrator.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Are there other things to keep in mind when you're making this decision?
Definitely. With choreography, each service needs to know what the others are doing. They're dependent on each other. It's like each dancer has to know their own steps, but they also have to be aware of what the other dancers are doing at the same time.
So they don't bump into each other.
Exactly. Orchestration, though, that puts all the decision-making in one place.
With the orchestrator.
They're like the single source of truth for everything that's happening in the saga.
So it's a trade-off between flexibility and control, like most things in life, right?
Pretty much.
But no matter which way you go, it seems like the Saga pattern is a really powerful solution for keeping data consistent in these microservice environments.
Oh, it's a game changer for sure. You get to have the flexibility and scalability of microservices, but you don't have to sacrifice data integrity.
Right.
You can have your cake and eat it too.
Right. But you did mention earlier that sagas aren't perfect. They have their challenges, like those isolation issues we talked about.
Yeah, isolation is important. It's about making sure that two sagas happening at the same time don't step on each other's toes. Like, remember those two customers both trying to buy that last gadget? Imagine one saga reserving the item while another one's processing the payment only to realize, uh-oh, we're all out.
And then somebody's getting a disappointing email.
Exactly.
So how do you prevent those saga collisions? Do we need like microscopic traffic cops?
It's more about making smart design choices, really. There are techniques like optimistic locking, where you basically check for any changes before you finalize a transaction, or versioning, where each update creates a new version of the data.
Okay, so you're tracking the changes over time.
Right. It adds a bit of complexity, but it's really important to prevent data from getting out of sync.
So it sounds like sagas need a lot of careful planning.
Yeah.
You really need to understand how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Absolutely.
What other kinds of pitfalls should developers be aware of?
Asynchronicity can be a tricky one.
Asynchronicity. It's a mouthful.
It's a big word, I know. But basically, things don't always happen instantly in a distributed system. Like in our online store example, the inventory service, it doesn't update the database the exact millisecond the payment goes through. There's a little bit of a delay as the event makes its way through the system.
Okay.
And those delays, they can cause problems, especially if different parts of the saga are relying on things happening in a very specific order.
So how do we make sure things run smoothly, even with those delays?
That's where some more advanced patterns come in. Things like event sourcing and transactional outbox, they can help keep things in sync.
Sounds like a topic for another deep dive.
Definitely. We could talk about those for hours.
All right, so to wrap things up, sagas are a really powerful way to manage transactions in a microservices world. They help us keep our data in order, even when things are spread out across different services.
They really represent a shift in how we think about designing systems. We're moving away from those older, more rigid approaches to something that's more flexible, more resilient.
It's about finding that balance between control and flexibility, understanding the trade-offs, and ultimately creating systems that are both powerful and reliable. So for anyone who wants to learn more about Sagas, we'll link to Chris Richardson's work in the show notes. He's got a ton of great resources on this topic.
Definitely check it out.
And don't forget to hit that follow button. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, you name it, we're probably there. We'll catch you all in the next deep dive.